All right, so we're continuing in the story of Jonah, and which is a neat story. Everybody knows the story of Jonah, like from Sunday school as a kid. Yeah, I do. Throughout this series, try to kind of put that out of your mind as best as possible. It's a really good story, and I think there's a little bit more fun we can have with it if you don't kind of just rush straight to the end. So the first part, we have our first slide, which is Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. And, almost there. So the key thing in there is God is always present, right? So, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. So if we go back to last week, God told Jonah to go to Nineveh. But he decided to go to one of the most difficult towns to pronounce that I've encountered in the Bible, of Tarshish. That's just hard to say, Tarshish. But he decided to go the complete opposite way that Joe talked about last week, to flee the presence of God, which seems kind of ludicrous, because how do you flee God who is everywhere, in all places, in all things, and at all times, always? You can't really flee from that. But Jonah tried, and it didn't work out for Jonah very well. So before we continue on, I'm actually going to, Becky, if you'll leave the slide up there, I'm actually going to read chapter 1, verses 4 through 17, and then go back and talk about the parts, because I just want you to hear this part of the story as an intact piece of story before we dig into it. So Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 17. The Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his god, lowercase g, his pagan god. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. But the captain came and said to him, "What are you doing, sound asleep? Get up, call on your god," still lowercase g. "Perhaps the God will spare us a thought that we do not perish." The sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said, "I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men know that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. That's a good word. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to dry land. But when they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them, then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So that's just the first of 4 chapters. And I want to stop it there and try not to think ahead. I don't know if that feedback's coming from me. Sorry about that. Because we don't know. It leaves us in a point of some wonder about what's going to happen later in the next chapter. And Joe will get into that next week. But the first part I want to point out is this reading we had in Jonah a little bit ago. We can't run away from God, because God is everywhere, always, and in all things, and we can't run away from God. This reminds me of there's a psychiatrist named Carl Jung that we had to study in college. Carl Jung, interesting fella. Above his home, he had a Latin inscription that said, bidden or not bidden, God is present. This is a person who studies all the torments of the mind, and he knew that whether you liked it or not, whether you asked for it or not, whether you intended it or not, God was present in your life. And my wife got me a plaque I have in my office there on the wall, and I had it in my office above the door when I worked at the police department, because it reminds me, in all things that go on, God is present. God never abandons us, and we cannot run away from the presence of God. And this brings us to we have another slide, Becky, I believe, verses 7 through 10. So the sailors said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots so that we may know whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" "I am a Hebrew," he replied. "I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. So Jonah tried to run away from God, and more importantly, tried to run away from God's mission that God had given to Jonah to go to Nineveh. So he tried to go the complete opposite direction. But God pursued Jonah. And it's the same for us today. Even if we try to turn away from God's mission, God is going to pursue us, and we're not going to be able to get away from it. Which is the good news, because even with our own doing and our own tendency towards sin, we can't run away from the one who loves us and saves us. A lot of times the circumstances we find ourselves in when we're running away from God will affect other people. In this case, Jonah's shipmates were being affected by Jonah trying to run away from God because they were in the storm too. And thinking about a little over a week ago, 2 Sundays ago, when the tornado came through, and the things that I saw happen in society afterwards, in Rogers and in Bentonville, people helping other people out, which is what the church is supposed to do. But imagine if instead of doing that, all of us just decided to turn away from that mission and just to stay at home and mind our own business. I was reminded of this even more this last week when my wife and I were in New Orleans. So on June 6th, the 80th anniversary of the landings of D-Day, we went to the National World War II Museum and saw videos and artifacts and all the information about the D-Day landings. And think about what it might have meant for the people languishing in Dachau if all those service members had just decided to not answer the call and just stay home. The world would look a lot different today, probably. So our obedience or disobedience both will affect the people who are around us. That circumstance that we will be in is not just us. It will affect our families and our neighbors. Becky, you have the next slide, verses 11 through 12. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. It's a good word. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you." So he knew that this storm was because of his disobedience. And for some reason, he didn't just decide to jump over the side. I don't know why. Like, was he a little guy? Was it kind of like, anybody here seen Lord of the Rings? The Two Towers, and Gimli, who looks at Aragorn and says, "I can't jump the distance, you're going to have to toss me." Like, I wonder, like Jonah, was he a little guy and couldn't reach the side and was like, "Oh, I can't make it over, you're going to have to toss me"? Or more than likely, was he just terrified? Has anybody here ever been on the ocean at night before? It's a lot of darkness that just seems to go on forever. I've been in the ocean at night. I've been in the ocean in storms, but I've never been in the ocean at night during a storm. I can only imagine how scary that would be. And I wonder if Jonah was just so paralyzed by fear that he couldn't throw himself over the edge, and so he had to turn to his shipmates and say, "You'll have to toss me." And they did. They tossed him into the ocean. Now, what hope would Jonah ever have of not drowning, bless you, being tossed into the ocean during a storm? He'd have no hope of surviving. They didn't have life jackets. But I think what Jonah knew is that his shipmates on that boat would have a hope of living and not drowning because of him being cast into the ocean, because he knew it was because of his disobedience to God that they were in the storm. That's a lot of courage. And I think, especially if you think about the idea, and I don't know this is me kind of trying to figure it out because it's not in the text, but if he's just too terrified to climb over the side and they have to throw him, I mean, that's really courage because he's obviously scared. Bravery can't exist without fear. And sometimes this shows us, and we see it in other examples, that following God's calling for us means putting the needs of other people before our own. But we're not very good at that. And so our fourth point here, verses 13 to 17. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked Jonah up and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So if you notice, there's a transition, and it's more apparent when in one of my classes we had to go through and do an exegesis, like a big explanation of all the different points of Jonah 1 in our Hebrew language class. And you can see it in the English translation where it starts off that these other mariners are praying to their individual gods, lowercase g. And they were terrified, and Jonah wasn't. He was asleep during the storm, but then it gets to a point where they find out who he is and that he worships God. The God that created the seas and the land and the God who created that storm, and they were more terrified. And then the language shifts to they began to pray to the Lord, capital L. And in the Hebrew, it's Adonai, which is the covenantal name of God. They quit praying to their pagan gods and started praying to the one true God who created everything and who is everywhere and at all times. They were brought to faith through Jonah's disobedience. I don't know that that was the intention, but God used it anyway. Now, Jonah, he didn't want to drown, I'm sure, but he knew that he had to be cast into God's will. He had to submit to God's will. And God provided for him a rescue. Not the one he probably wanted. He probably would like to have had another boat, but he got a really big fish. I remember in Sunday school, it was always a whale. And I wondered, did they know the difference between mammals and fish then? I don't know. We don't know. All we know is there's a large fish that could swallow up Jonah. Not the rescue he probably wanted. And a lot of times in our circumstances, we get the rescue we need, but not always the one that we want. But because Jonah submitted to the will of God, he was saved. And later on, we'll read about how he actually pursued God's call for him. Now, thankfully, most of us, we all have callings. Most of us, thankfully, don't include being thrown into an ocean at night in a storm or being swallowed by a fish. But the offside is Jonah knew exactly what God wanted him to do. God told him in a loud, booming voice, and he knew what he needed to do. For most of the rest of us, it's a little more difficult than that. We don't just know it. We have to discern it through prayer and through collaboration with fellow Christians to help us to discern what God's call is for our life. But it's not an opportunity we can miss if we're not paying attention at the right time. Your calling that God has for you is not an opportunity you've missed in your past. It's not just a fleeting thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have read the story about Jonah. God will pursue us. And I kind of think that the longer we ignore God's call, the louder it gets. And hopefully we can discern that call and answer it before it turns into a storm that we're thrown into. But sometimes it does. So quick, I got time, quick cop story for you. As an off-duty cop, I've encountered so many people that I arrested, which is not always a good thing. But time after time, I've had people come up and shake my hand and say, "Hey, officer, are you still working? It's nice to see you again." And I'm like, you look familiar, but I don't know where I recognize you from. And sometimes they look a lot different, especially if they've recovered from an addiction or gotten out of an abusive relationship. They look healthier. And a lot of times I just can't recognize all of them. But I've had so many people thank me for having arrested them because I take them out of a circumstance they could not get themselves out of. And sometimes God does it that way, and it's a blessing. And they don't think it's a blessing when they're in the back seat in handcuffs. And sometimes when we're in a storm that makes it apparent to us that we're not following God's will, it doesn't feel like a blessing. But anything that turns us away from our own will and back to the will of God sooner rather than later is a blessing. Even if that blessing looks like it's coming in the form of consequences. None of my kids thought that being grounded or stuck in their room or toys taken away was a blessing. But I meant it that way. And God means that way for us a lot of times when storms happen to keep us from going too far down that road. Jonah was faced with mortal jeopardy of the potential of drowning, but he was saved from drowning by the fish and given another opportunity. One day we will all face mortality. We will all face imminent death. It's part of being human. But through another miracle, God has provided a way for us to still live. Ours isn't in the form of a storm and a big fish. Ours is in the form of Jesus Christ. Even though we're going to flee the wrong way and we're going to go through storms of life, God has provided a way that we can be saved from our own doing and return to God. And that happens for us as Christians because of our faith in God and the grace of God, that just as Jesus was resurrected, because we've been immersed in the baptisms of water and not a stormy ocean, that one day when we do meet death, we have a promise that we will be resurrected and be together with God again in heaven. And that's really good news because I'm going to mess it up. But God will be there to catch us, every one of us, when we do mess it up. And we have that promise that cannot be taken away from us, no matter how hard we run the opposite direction. So that's an awful lot I just went through. That's the whole rest of chapter 1. But just as some takeaways, remember, we can't run from God, so don't even try it. It's not going to work. And God provides us many blessings, and sometimes those blessings look like consequences, and we just can't tell the difference. Now, the question for you to talk about on the way home, do you think that what you're doing in your life right now is pursuing God's calling for you, or do you think you're running away from it? What do you think it is? And are you pursuing it, or are you running away from it? When I first felt the call to go to seminary was like 20 years before I actually started. So it's okay if you take your time. It'll be there. If you'll fold your hands with me in prayer, please. Heavenly Father, in the midst of life's storms, help us to cling to you in faith, knowing that even when the waves crash around us, your love for us remains. Grant us the courage to trust your plan for our lives, even when it leads us into the depths of uncertainty. Give us the strength to heed your call with unwavering obedience, knowing that your will for our lives is always filled with purpose and grace. Guide us, O Lord, as we navigate the tempests of life, anchoring our faith in your promises and following your will with open hearts and willing spirits. And all God's people